Welcome. You tuned in to Salam Media with myself, Salailo, and thank you so much for joining us. As I mentioned before, you went on an ad break. We'll be speaking to political analyst Professor Seepe, and he wrote a really interesting article regarding, in the article, essentially exposing the truths behind the rise and fall of Jacob Zuma from Ramaphoria to Ramageddon. So basically, a lot that had to do with the elections and what really happened, and also the big story which emerged out of those elections, which was the rise of the MK and former President Jacob Zuma, and also the future, where to from here, regarding, coalitions and, President Ramaphosa, and where does this leave him? And he's joining us via StreamYard, Professor Sipho. Welcome to Salam Media, Prof. Thank you so much for giving us your time.
Oh, thank you for inviting me.
First and foremost, I think the big story out of the elections is obviously the MK and the rise of former President Jacob Zuma making his ferry back into South African politics. What can we make of this? What's behind this surge and this seemingly obsession with President Jacob Zuma by South African people, by the people that casted their votes, almost 2 million of them that have voted for him and the MK?
Well, first, as Mbalula did indicate, that there is what you call a Zuma factor. But what you are saying is that the popularity of the former president, Jacob Zuma, was never in question. It was only in question among those people who have made it their business to dislike him. And people should remember that the ANC only won KwaZulu-Natal because of him. And that much is now even being acknowledged by the ANC. And the ANC also acknowledges that they also underestimated the level of support that he had. And what people have expressed is a form of shock at the performance of MK. But if they had stopped misleading themselves by saying the former president is a political has-been, they would not have been shocked. They would have understood better the performance of the ANC. And when he pulled out of the ANC saying he's going to support a new party called Umkhonto Wesizwe, it was obvious that the support that he enjoys within the ANC will go with him. And that's what happened. And there are also indications that not only did he take support from the ANC, he also took support from IFP as well as EFF. So that is what is called the Zuma factor. But what my article sought to also address is the misconceptions that were deliberate and the false narratives that were bandied around with repeated monotony. And the one is that which I've just mentioned, that he was a political has-been, but also to suggest that President Ramaphosa was very popular and even more popular than the ANC, which was never the case. It was something that the white media sought to push, and the ANC also started believing it. Ramaphosa's support only lies from derives from the fact that he's the president of the ANC, and only that. And also he happens to be somebody who enjoys support from racists and people who hate the ANC. So should Ramaphosa move away from being a president of the ANC, that popularity will fizzle out overnight because it was never there. So what these elections did was also to show that that was always a myth. And as a matter of fact, the whole notion of Ramaphoria was based on that false narrative that was deliberately crafted. And what we have seen is a cataclysmic decline of the ANC since Ramaphosa took over. It started in 2019 when the ANC lost about 5% of the vote. This time around, the decline was precipitous, in a sense that in one cycle, electoral cycle, the ANC lost almost 17%. That by any stretch of imagination is a operation decapitation, or what the Americans will call shock and awe, or Operation Desert Storm. So one must accept that reality, that those lies were shown to be untrue. Then the third one that was exposed to have been a lie is the whole myth, without even, of course, like all myths, they are without substance, is a so-called 9 wasted years. Actually, what we've heard under Ramaphosa is the most disastrous years, and he has so far been branded as the worst president that South Africa has actually produced. But what is important is the lived experiences of Black people and the lived experience of white people. So when you talk to Black people and you talk to Black students, they will tell you about NSFAS. They will tell you about the fact that the poor can now access higher education, whereas in the past, it was based on your economic status. It was under Jacob Zuma that that was addressed. It was under Jacob Zuma that you had new universities. It was under Jacob Zuma that you had the rollout of HIV/AIDS, or the antiretrovirals to deal with HIV/AIDS. So the people who are beneficiaries, they don't see Jacob Zuma's years as 9 wasted years. You talk to a Black business, they will tell you that things have never been harder for them. And they remember, and with nostalgia, when Jacob Zuma used to talk to DGs in government, that when people do business with the state, they should be paid within 30 days upon submission of invoices. These are the realities that Black people have experienced in the main Black business when it comes to Jacob Zuma's years. So people voted on the basis of that experience, not on the basis of the lies that have been told by the media. So these elections were largely about disrupting those false narratives. The other
Prof,
narrative that was
Prof,
false.
before we go forward, I want to jump in there. You present some very, very valid points regarding the success that former President Jacob Zuma came with, not only for the ANC and how they performed, but also for the country in general. Speaking of on NSFAS and other various projects that he embarked on, that a lot of Black people really, really benefited from. But again, it was during former President Jacob Zuma's years, where the term state capture started to make its way into South African politics. We had the Guptas, who we previously didn't know, making their fare in South African politics. We had there's also the issue of the arms deal, which is also closely associated with former President Jacob Zuma. Are those net enough to ignore? Looking at his legacy, what can we make of the negatives, and ultimately the reason why former President Jacob Zuma had to resign, apart from all the positives that you are mentioning?
Well, first of all, the arms deal took place under the Mandela and Mbeki presidency. Jacob Zuma at the time was in Natal. And it is actually a case of people wanting to listen to the stories and the narrative that they actually created. And if we accept, and it is what Andrew Feinstein has been saying, that when you talk about the arms deal, that deal was construed during the Mbeki Mandela era in 1998. The former president only became the deputy president of the ANC in 1997, and also the deputy president of the country in 1999. So one must also put that in terms of that context. Then you must also talk about the state capture. And if you read the Zondo Commission and you look at the amount of money that's said to be linked to the state capture, you're talking about the 47 billion. That's as far as he came up to with that number. And if you look at the budget that the ANC or the fiscals, every year it's about 1.5 trillion. If you compare now the numbers, it becomes minuscule to actually claim that. But what we have done is that we should not excuse that, but we must also listen to the other people who are saying, what about the evergreen contracts that Mulefe was talking about? When he says, actually, if you want to talk about the state capture, it occurs largely in the private sector that continues to get the billions, even as we speak. They are actually running away. And he says, if you now take the Gupta's relationship with the ESCOM, they were supplying less than about 4% of coal. And says, why are we not asking the other questions that who's supplying the 96%? But as Black people, were so used to focusing on crumbs than the whole bread. So, in a sense, the message that was coming from the Zondo Commission that the majority of people chose not to hear is what people could also hear, that yes, we hear that, and yes, we accept that's wrong. But why don't you talk about the Ramaphosa's involvement in with Glencoe, a Glencoe that has been considered to be a crime scene by a number of countries, where it has also been, fined billions by other countries. But when it comes to South Africa, suddenly nothing is seen about the Glencoe. And the Zondo Commission, even as we speak, it is actually being challenged. A number of people like Coco have said, well, that report is actually rubbish. And then now he says the very same Zondo seems to be unable to come to the court to make sure that he is actually convicted. The same applies to Brian Molefe. If the matters were as clear as that, we should have these guys already in jail. But the person who is in charge of the NPA says most of it was mere hearsay. And actually, what's his name? Figila Mbalula says anybody who wants to urinate can go to the Zondo Commission, simply because the Zondo Commission was more a place of largely, well, there was testimonies, but most of it was the hearsay. And that is why this matter must actually be looked at. So the state capture was also one of those that were propounded, but its scale was also distorted. What we do need to do, and one must say, those who were involved must be arrested, must be convicted, and must go to jail. But at the same time, we must also talk about those who benefit. And what we have here is we get angry at the crime committed by Black people. But when you talk about the white people engage in criminality, then there is a protection. You take somebody like Cyril Ramaphosa. Here's somebody who, according to the former Chief Justice, has violated several laws. That is there's a prima facie case that he is guilty of a number of laws in this country. He's also violated the Constitution. This is what the former Chief Justice and the senior judge says. But where is the media that says this guy must be held to account? Where are these foundations that every time there's the Zuma, they rush to the courts? But when it comes to Ramaphosa, there is a protection. And our people are alive to that hypocrisy. They're alive to that those double standards. And they are also saying, we're not going to buy it. You can choose to believe what you want to believe. But when we are able to exercise something that we don't have the money to rush to the courts to defend whoever. We don't have the rights to go to the courts to make sure that the courts deliver a particular fairness and justice. But what we have is a vote. And we're going to use our vote. And this is what the people have actually done.
Prof, after the elections, obviously, we've all seen the numbers, the MK emerging as the third biggest party, in South Africa. And this has presented, very, very interesting scenarios going forward. I just want to pick your brain with regards to that. Just to throw forward, you have the ANC sitting at 40%, obviously losing that outright majority. You have the DA coming in still as the official opposition, but you have what many consider the kingmakers of this year's elections, the MK. And now coalition talks are starting to take place. A lot of people saying, an ANC DA coalition would be what's best for South Africa. It would be what's best for, sustainability and also pleasing international markets. But then you have another, opinion that says, an ANC, EFF, MK, IFP coalition is the change that South Africa needs, where you'll have, pro-black, change and reform in South Africa, and retaining the economy back to the the indigenous people of South Africa. What can we make of these two scenarios? Which one is most likely to happen, and which one is the correct one that South Africa needs going forward, that all South Africans can rest assured that there won't be any drastic changes in South Africa. We can continue as a country and at least have some trajectory going forward into the future, or at least leading up to the next elections?
Well, the first thing that we must accept is that we subscribe to the notion that we need to respect the will of the people. And if we respect the will of the people, it makes sense that the ANC at the national level will be a party that should be given first choice in forming government. That is obvious. But now, of course, it's also possible that the opposition parties can gang up against the ANC, can also make a claim that 60% of the people did not support the ANC. So that is one. But from the perspective of saying this, the ANC got the majority, and let that be respected. And the second issue related to that is if we now look at the race relations in this country, and you look at the black vote, and the black vote will be IFP, ANC, MK, and other parties. All those parties, when they are combined, they go beyond 60%. And from the perspective of saying, if you say the people shall govern, and you're also talking about the people who have been historically excluded, then you'll have a black vote making sense. But also you must factor in the history of the DA with regard to issues like affirmative action or black economic empowerment. And actually, as I speak, the BBC, the Black Business Council, has actually urged the ANC to consider the orientation of parties when it comes to black economic empowerment. We have also seen how the DA has treated the most prominent black people. All of them, they went into the DA thinking that there's something special about them. And one by one, they go out there with licking their wounds, regretting to have been made projects of white supremacy. So if the ANC wants to abandon a clear mandate from largely black people, the very grouping that it gets is majority, then it can go with the DA, and the next election will be almost like the ANC has written its own death wish. And so that is one. And the notion of the markets is a very interesting one, because this is what we also told pre-1994, that we should not even bother to get involved in this notion of struggle, because look at what is happening in the rest of Africa, as if things were any better for South Africans in this country. And also, if people tell you about the markets, then why are we engaged in voting? Why don't we leave it to the markets, because they will know better for us? And that is actually nonsense, because the markets can be disciplined. The markets will want to come to South Africa precisely because we own and we control the minerals. The reason why we are not able to put that is because some so-called the markets, which is really a way of saying white interest, is that the white interest has been able to co-opt some of us to advance the white interest. We need to understand that every system of oppression and subjugation and super exploitation goes to those it exploits, and get what you call security guards for its own interest. We've seen that during slavery, where the house slaves became useful for the perpetuation of slavery. We've seen it during apartheid, where the regime could rely on sellouts among black people to make sure that they become junior partners in the suppression of their own people. So when these coalitions are considered, all these other issues must be brought to bear. That whose interest do you serve? And don't tell us that a party that has benefited largely from the super exploitation of African people, a party that tells us that land does not matter, that party represents the interest of African people.
Prof, just lastly, before I let you go, I mean, we've seen coalitions play out in, the different metros and municipalities and provinces and councils across South Africa, and it hasn't been a pleasing picture. 30 years in, is our democracy mature enough to have a coalition government at a national level, considering really a mess of what we've been seeing in metros across South Africa that are in coalitions?
Well, if we did not believe in democracy, you may as well have a dictatorship and then you'll not have any form of coalitions. What we have here is the will of the people, and that is where we start. What are the people saying? What are the voters saying? The voters in this country say they cannot entrust any party with the majority vote. So any suggestion that we should not have coalition is an insult to the democratic expression of South Africans, black and white. So the message is clear that the ANC messed up. It had an outright majority for a number of years, 30 years. And look at where we are today. It has failed dismally to change really the material conditions of African people. It has failed to change the socio-economic power relations between the beneficiaries of apartheid colonialism and those who were victims of apartheid colonialism. So the people themselves have actually said, this is where we go. And let us also not pretend that coalitions won't work. You just have to look at the number of countries beyond our borders, especially in Europe, where there are a number of coalitions that have worked. But what the experience gives us, the lessons that it derive from the failures at municipalities, is to say, what are the bottom lines? What are the few things that you can agree on? And in a sense, when Mashaba was mayor of Joburg, and some of us did not even give him a chance because we thought he was a businessman and he had no politics. But he was able to keep that coalition working. He walked out only when Helen Zille was elected the federal chairperson of the DA. And it was also after he had said, if you're going to elect this person, I'm walking away. But at that time, he was able to put a glue where he could work with the EFF, where he could work with the ANC, where he could work with other parties. But it was because he knew who he was serving, that in the end, the government must focus on the poorest of the poor, because those can only get salvation from grinding poverty only through government intervention. And this is what made things work. So what is necessary for coalitions to work is that the parties must put down what are the things we can agree on and focus on that. And what they can agree on is to serve the poorest of the poor.
All right, I think we're going to leave it there, Prof. Really interesting times ahead, and I'm sure we'll be having you on just to unpack all the different coalition outcomes that might be coming out in the different provinces and, of course, nationally. But we're going to leave it here for now. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
There was political analyst Professor Sipho there, just giving us insight on the rise of former President Jacob Zuma back and his influence into South African politics, and also what is seemingly a demise of current President Cyril Ramaphosa, who some say might be recalled from the ANC after this dismal showing in the recent elections. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, still sticking with the theme of elections, we'll be speaking to project manager at the Center for Mediation in Africa, at the University of Pretoria, Dr. Croatia Ismail Soliman, and we'll be unpacking the Muslim vote and just how Muslims voted in the recent elections and the impact of that vote and some of the trends of how the Muslims of South Africa have voted and what influenced that vote. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, Dr. Croatia Ismail Soliman joins us.